The greatest gift you could give us is to disappear from our lives. My son-in-law said it so calmly that for a moment I thought I had misheard him. The words hung in the air above the dinner table like something cold and heavy. No one laughed. No one corrected him. My daughter Emily stared down at her plate, slowly pushing a green bean across the china with her fork. And just like that, I understood that the sentence hadn't been a joke. It had been a request. Or maybe a decision that had already been made without me. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, a retired elementary school librarian from Cedar Falls, Iowa, and until that moment I believed I was still part of my daughter's family. Sunday dinners had always been my favorite part of the week. The smell of roast chicken, the soft clatter of silverware, my granddaughter Lily's bright laugh echoing down the hallway. Those evenings used to feel like proof that all the years I spent raising Emily alone had been worth it. After my husband Robert passed away 3 years ago, those dinners became even more important to me. They were the closest thing I had left to the life we built together. That night started like any other. I arrived at their house just before 6, carrying a glass baking dish filled with peach cobbler. Lily ran to the door when I knocked, her sneakers squeaking on the hardwood floor as she wrapped her arms around my waist. "Grandma, Mom said you might bring dessert." I kissed the top of her head and handed the dish to Emily in the kitchen, while Daniel stood at the counter scrolling through something on his phone. Everything looked normal. The dining room table was set with the blue plates Emily had inherited from my mother, the same plates I had used at our own Sunday dinners for decades. But when we finally sat down, something felt different. Daniel barely looked up from his plate. Emily kept glancing toward him as if waiting for permission before speaking. Lily talked about a spelling test she had passed at school, her voice cheerful and proud, but even she seemed to notice the quiet that followed each sentence. Halfway through the meal, Daniel set his fork down and wiped his mouth with his napkin. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even sound angry. That was the strangest part. He simply looked across the table at me the way someone might look at a piece of furniture they had decided to move. "Margaret," he said, using my first name the way he always did when he wanted to sound polite. "Emily and I have been talking about something for a while." Emily shifted in her chair, but still didn't meet my eyes. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Daniel gave a small sigh, like someone preparing to deliver practical news about a broken appliance. "The truth is," he continued, "the greatest gift you could give us right now is to disappear from our lives." The words settled quietly into the room. Lily looked up in confusion. Emily still didn't say anything. I felt the blood drain from my face, but strangely enough, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply picked up my glass of iced tea and took a slow sip, as if the conversation had nothing to do with me. Because in that moment I realized something important. When someone calmly tells you to disappear, it usually means they've already started imagining life without you. The drive home that night felt longer than the usual 15 minutes. The streets of Cedar Falls were quiet, the way small towns always become after dinner, with porch lights glowing softly and the occasional car passing through an intersection. I kept both hands on the steering wheel and watched the familiar road slip by under the yellow streetlights. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone. The silence in the car felt heavy, but not unfamiliar. Since Robert passed away, silence had become something I knew how to sit with. When I pulled into my driveway, the little white house looked exactly the same as it always had. The maple tree in the front yard rustled gently in the evening breeze, and the porch light I had left on earlier cast a warm circle across the wooden steps. For a moment I stayed inside the car with the engine off, staring at the house. Robert and I bought it 37 years ago, back when Emily was still learning to ride a bicycle. The mortgage had seemed impossibly large at the time, but Robert always said a home was the one place in the world that should never feel temporary. I finally stepped out of the car and carried the empty baking dish inside. The kitchen smelled faintly like cinnamon from the cobbler I had baked earlier that afternoon. I set the dish in the sink and turned on the faucet, letting the warm water run over my hands while the events of the evening replayed slowly in my mind. Daniel's voice had not been loud or angry. That was the part that stayed with me the most. It had been calm, almost reasonable, like someone explaining a practical solution to a small problem. I dried my hands with a dish towel and walked into the living room where Robert's old armchair still sat beside the window. The lamp next to it was on, just the way I had left it that morning. I lowered myself into the chair and looked around the room. The photographs on the mantel showed a different version of our family. Emily at age 8 holding a soccer trophy that was nearly as tall as she was. Emily at her college graduation in a blue cap and gown, smiling so wide that her eyes nearly disappeared. And another photo from the day she married Daniel. Robert had been alive then, standing proudly beside her in a dark suit. I remember how relieved I felt that day, believing my daughter had found someone who would take care of her long after I was gone. I reached for the small framed picture of Lily that sat closest to the edge of the mantel. She was missing 2 front teeth in the photo, her grin bright and crooked. Earlier that evening she had looked confused when Daniel spoke, as if she could not understand why the adults in the room had suddenly become so quiet. Children always notice things that adults pretend not to see. I placed the photo back on the mantel and leaned back in the chair. The house creaked softly the way older houses do at night. Normally those sounds felt comforting to me, but tonight they seemed to echo through empty rooms. I thought about the way Emily had avoided my eyes during dinner. She had not defended me. She had not asked Daniel to stop. She had simply sat there in silence, as though the decision had already been discussed many times before I ever walked through their front door. That realization settled slowly in my chest. I had spent years believing that if something truly mattered, Emily would always speak up. Yet tonight she had not said a single word. I stood up after a while and walked down the hallway to the small office where Robert used to keep our paperwork. The wooden desk was still covered with neatly stacked folders and envelopes. I opened the top drawer and saw the same labeled files Robert had organized years ago. Taxes, insurance, property documents. Robert had always been careful about details, especially when it came to protecting the things we worked hard to build together. I pulled one folder halfway out of the drawer, then paused. For the first time since leaving Emily's house, a different thought crossed my mind. Daniel believed I was someone who could simply disappear, someone who would quietly step aside and make life easier for everyone else. I closed the drawer slowly and turned off the light in the office. Tomorrow morning, I decided, I would begin taking a closer look at a few things Robert had arranged long before any of us imagined this conversation would ever happen. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen over Cedar Falls. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. For a moment I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of the clock and the distant hum of a truck driving down Maple Street. Normally I would make coffee right away and sit by the kitchen window to watch the neighborhood wake up, but that morning my mind kept returning to the desk in Robert's old office. The words from the night before were still there in the back of my thoughts, calm and clear, as if they had been spoken only seconds ago. I did not feel angry. What I felt instead was something quieter, something more careful. I slipped out of bed, put on my robe, and walked down the hallway toward the office with the same slow steps I used whenever I did not want to disturb the stillness of the house. The office had not changed much since Robert passed away. His old desk lamp still sat on the corner of the wooden desk, and the framed photograph of us taken during a summer trip to Lake Michigan rested beside a stack of neatly labeled folders. Robert had always believed that paperwork should be organized before problems ever appeared. I turned on the lamp and pulled out the chair, the legs making a soft sound across the hardwood floor. For a moment, I simply looked at the drawer I had closed the night before. It seemed strange that a simple wooden drawer could suddenly feel so important. I opened it slowly and began sliding the folders out one by one. Insurance documents, property records, tax statements from years ago. Robert's handwriting appeared on several of the labels, small and careful the way it always had been. I remembered how he used to sit at this same desk on Saturday mornings, wearing his reading glasses while Emily played on the living room carpet with her dolls. Back then the house was always full of sound. I placed several folders on the desk and finally found the one Robert had labeled Simply Property and Trust. The paper inside felt slightly thick and official, the kind of paper that lawyers seem to prefer. I unfolded the first page and began reading slowly, letting each sentence settle before moving to the next. Robert had arranged far more than I realized. The house, the savings accounts, even a small investment account he had started years earlier without ever making a big announcement about it. That was the kind of man Robert had been. Quiet, careful, always thinking several steps ahead without needing recognition for it. As I read through the pages, A memory returned to me from a conversation we had shared one evening not long before his illness became serious. We had been sitting on the porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the fields outside town. Robert had looked out at the rain for a long moment before saying something that felt oddly serious at the time. He told me that families sometimes change in ways we cannot predict, and that it is wise to protect the things we build with patience. I remember laughing softly and telling him he was worrying too much. At the time, our life seemed stable and simple. Emily visited often. Daniel always greeted us politely. Lily was just a toddler learning to walk across our living room floor. None of us imagined that conversations about disappearing from someone's life would ever be spoken across a dinner table. I placed the papers back into the folder and leaned back in Robert's chair. The morning sunlight had begun to slip through the office window, casting pale gold lines across the desk. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street, and a dog barked twice before falling silent again. Life in Cedar Falls was continuing exactly as it always had. Yet inside that small office, something had quietly shifted. Daniel believed the solution to his discomfort was simple distance. He believed that if I stepped away, the pieces of their life would fall neatly into place. What he did not understand was that Robert had spent years making sure certain pieces could not be moved so easily. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back inside the drawer. For the first time since that dinner, a small and steady sense of clarity settled over me. Sometimes people think silence means weakness. Sometimes they believe that a calm reaction means surrender. But Robert had taught me something different. Patience is not the same thing as disappearing. I spent the rest of that morning moving through the house slowly, the way people do when they are thinking about things that cannot be rushed. The coffee pot hummed quietly on the kitchen counter while the smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Normally, that smell reminded me of calm mornings with Robert, when we would sit at the small round table near the window and read the newspaper together before the day began. That morning, I poured myself a cup, but barely tasted it. Instead, I sat there looking out at the backyard where the old maple tree cast long shadows across the grass. Emily used to play there for hours when she was little. I could still picture her running across the yard with scraped knees and tangled hair, laughing as Robert chased her with the garden hose on hot summer afternoons. Those memories were not dramatic or loud. They were simple and ordinary, the kind of moments that quietly build a family over decades. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug in the sink before walking back toward the living room. The house was full of reminders of those years. A faded school drawing Emily had made in third grade still hung on the refrigerator door. The colors had softened over time, but I never had the heart to take it down. On the bottom corner, she had written in careful letters, "I love you, Mom." I stood there looking at it for a long moment and felt a strange mixture of warmth and distance at the same time. Love does not disappear overnight, but sometimes it becomes buried under other voices. Daniel's voice had been the loudest one in the room during that dinner, but the silence from Emily had been the part that stayed with me. I walked into the hallway and paused outside the small closet where we kept old photo albums. I had not opened them in months. When I pulled one from the shelf and sat down on the couch, a thin layer of dust lifted into the air. The album opened to a photograph from Emily's high school graduation. She stood between Robert and me in a blue gown with a wide smile that seemed to reach every corner of the picture. Robert's hand rested proudly on her shoulder. That day, we believed we had given her a strong beginning in life. I slowly turned another page. There was a photograph from her wedding day. Daniel stood beside her in a dark suit, smiling confidently while Robert shook his hand. At the time, I remember feeling grateful that Emily had found someone who seemed steady and ambitious. Daniel spoke about future plans with such certainty that everyone around him believed he would build something stable for their family. Looking at that picture now, I noticed details I had overlooked before. The way Daniel stood slightly ahead of Emily. The way she looked toward him as if waiting for direction. Small things that had seemed unimportant at the time. I closed the album and rested it on the coffee table. Outside, a delivery truck passed slowly down the street, and the afternoon sun began to warm the front windows of the house. Life continued with the quiet rhythm of a normal day, but inside my thoughts something had settled into place. Families do not usually break apart with one dramatic moment. More often it happens through small shifts that go unnoticed until someone finally speaks the truth out loud. Daniel had spoken his truth very clearly at that dinner table. What he did not realize was that his words had also given me clarity. When people reveal what they truly believe about you, it becomes much easier to understand what must happen next. I stood up and walked back toward the hallway office where Robert's desk waited under the soft afternoon light. The folder inside that drawer was not just paperwork. It was a quiet reminder that the life Robert and I built together had been protected with care. And for the first time since that conversation at dinner, I felt something steady return to me. Not anger, not revenge, just the calm understanding that disappearing from someone's life is very different from surrendering the life you built. The afternoon moved quietly across the house, the kind of slow and ordinary afternoon that gives a person too much time to think. Sunlight stretched across the living room carpet while the clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 3 o'clock. I had just finished washing the breakfast dishes when the phone rang on the kitchen counter. The sound surprised me because it was not the usual time Emily called, and for a moment I simply stood there looking at the screen. The caller name read Lily. My granddaughter rarely called on her own. Usually Emily would be the one to dial, while Lily shouted something cheerful in the background. I answered after the second ring. "Hello, sweetheart." Her voice came through the phone small and careful, like someone trying not to be overheard. "Grandma, are you busy?" I leaned against the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the quiet street. "No, I am not busy at all. What is going on?" There was a short pause, and I could hear the faint sound of a television somewhere in the background. "I just wanted to talk to you," she said softly. Lily was 10 years old, but she had always been more observant than most children her age. Even when she was little, she seemed to notice the small shifts in a room before anyone else did. I pictured her sitting on the couch in their living room with her legs tucked under her, holding the phone with both hands. "Did something happen at school?" I asked. "No," she said quickly. "School is fine." Another pause followed, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice sounded uncertain. "Grandma, are you mad at Mom and Dad?" The question settled into the quiet kitchen like a small stone dropped into still water. I chose my words carefully. "No, sweetheart. I am not mad." It was the truth, though it was not the whole truth. Lily hesitated before speaking again. "Dad said maybe we will not see you for a while." Her voice lowered even further. "He said it might be better if you stayed away." I closed my eyes for a moment and took a slow breath. Daniel's words from the dinner table returned with perfect clarity. "The greatest gift you could give us is to disappear." Hearing the same idea repeated through Lily's voice made it feel colder somehow. "Did your mom say that too?" I asked gently. Lily did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than before. "Mom did not say anything." The silence behind that sentence told me everything I needed to know. I moved to the kitchen table and sat down, tracing a small circle on the wood surface with my fingertip. "Lily," I said softly, "sometimes adults have conversations that are confusing. That does not mean people stop caring about each other." I could hear her breathing quietly on the other end of the phone. "I still care about you very much," she said quickly. The earnestness in her voice made something warm rise in my chest. "I know you do," I replied. "And I care about you too. That does not change." Outside, a car drove slowly past the house, its tires humming against the pavement. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Lily said something that made me sit a little straighter in my chair. "Grandma, Dad was talking about your house yesterday." I felt a small shift in the air around me. "What about it?" She lowered her voice again. "He said maybe Mom should ask you if you want to sell it and move somewhere smaller." I looked toward the hallway where Robert's office door stood slightly open. The memory of the folder inside the desk drawer returned immediately. "Did he say why?" Lily answered without hesitation. "He said the house is too big for one person and it would make things easier." Easier. The word lingered in my thoughts long after she said it. I thanked Lily for calling and told her I loved her before we ended the conversation. When the phone went quiet in my hand, I remained seated at the kitchen table for several minutes. The afternoon sunlight had shifted slightly across the floor, and the house felt calm and still. Daniel believed the solution to his discomfort was distance. But now it was becoming clear that distance was only one part of what he wanted. I stood slowly and walked down the hallway toward Robert's office again, the quiet creak of the floorboards following each step. Sometimes children repeat things adults do not intend them to repeat. And sometimes those small moments reveal far more than anyone expects. The hallway felt quieter than before as I stepped back into Robert's office, the late afternoon light stretching across the wooden floor in long golden lines. I closed the door gently behind me and walked toward the desk that had once been the center of Robert's careful routines. For years he had sat here balancing checkbooks, reviewing paperwork, and making quiet plans that rarely required discussion. At the time, I had always teased him for being overly cautious. Now I understood that he had simply been thoughtful about the future in ways I had not needed to consider. I pulled the chair out slowly and sat down again, opening the same desk drawer where the folder rested among several neatly labeled files. The words Lily had repeated over the phone lingered in my thoughts. The house is too big for one person. It would make things easier. Daniel had always spoken about things in practical terms. Easier, efficient, reasonable. Words that sounded harmless until you looked more closely at what they truly meant. I lifted the folder from the drawer and placed it carefully on the desk. The paper inside was still arranged exactly as I had left it that morning. Robert's signature appeared at the bottom of several documents, steady and deliberate. I began reading more slowly this time, letting each page reveal details that I had once trusted him to handle quietly on his own. The trust document described the structure Robert had arranged years ago, not long after Emily married Daniel. I remembered that period clearly now. Robert had spent several weekends meeting with a lawyer downtown while I stayed home preparing dinner. At the time, he had simply told me he wanted to make sure everything was organized properly for the future. I had not asked many questions, because that had always been Robert's way of caring for the family. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. The house was protected within the trust. It could not simply be sold because someone believed it would make life more convenient. Certain decisions required my approval alone. Other provisions were designed to ensure that what Robert and I built would eventually pass carefully to the next generation. My eyes paused on one particular paragraph that mentioned Lily by name. Robert had always adored his granddaughter. Even when she was only a toddler, he had talked about the importance of making sure she would always have a place that felt secure. I leaned back in the chair and allowed the information to settle slowly in my mind. Daniel believed the situation was simple. He believed a suggestion about selling the house might eventually lead to a quiet agreement. Perhaps he imagined that an older woman living alone would eventually accept the idea of downsizing to something smaller and more convenient. Many people think that age automatically brings uncertainty. But Robert had prepared these documents at a time when our family still gathered happily around the same dinner table. He had not been responding to conflict. He had simply been planning carefully for possibilities that others might overlook. Outside the office window, the sky had begun to shift toward evening, and the sounds of the neighborhood grew softer as people returned home from work. I closed the folder gently and returned it to the drawer, sliding it back into place among the other documents. The room felt calm, almost reassuring. For the first time since that dinner conversation, I could see the shape of the situation clearly. Daniel had asked me to disappear, but disappearing from someone's daily routine does not mean abandoning the life that was built long before their request. I stood up from the chair and turned off the desk lamp, letting the quiet evening light fill the office instead. Sometimes the most powerful response to a demand is not immediate confrontation. Sometimes the wiser response is patience, observation, and understanding exactly which pieces of the future truly belong to you. I slept lightly that night, waking once when the old house shifted quietly in the cool air of early morning. By the time the sun rose above the rooftops of Cedar Falls, I was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The routine felt familiar and steady. Coffee brewed slowly in the machine, while a slice of toast warmed in the toaster. The ordinary sounds of the kitchen had always been comforting to me. They reminded me that life continues even when conversations leave lasting echoes. After breakfast, I rinsed my plate, folded the dish towel neatly on the counter, and glanced at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Tuesday. Robert used to say Tuesdays were good days to handle practical matters because the week had settled into its rhythm by then. That thought stayed with me as I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had not called in several years. The law office downtown answered on the third ring. A calm voice introduced herself, and I explained that I was Margaret Whitmore and that my late husband had once worked with their firm regarding a family trust. There was a brief pause while she searched their records. Then her voice returned, warm and professional. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore, we still have your file. She asked if I would like to schedule a meeting with Mr. Harold Bennett, the attorney who had originally handled Robert's documents. I told her that would be helpful. The appointment was set for 10:30 that morning. The law office stood only 12 minutes from my house, just across the small downtown square where the brick buildings had looked the same for decades. I arrived a few minutes early and parked along Maple Avenue, watching a pair of college students cross the street with backpacks slung over their shoulders. Inside the office, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper. The receptionist greeted me kindly and asked me to have a seat. When Mr. Bennett stepped into the waiting room a few moments later, he looked almost exactly as I remembered him. His hair had turned slightly grayer, but his posture and calm expression were unchanged. He shook my hand warmly and led me into his office. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes. I explained the recent conversation at dinner without anger, simply describing the words that had been spoken and the suggestion that I might sell the house. Mr. Bennett listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the documents he had pulled from the file cabinet beside his desk. When I finished speaking, he folded his hands together and nodded slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "your husband prepared these arrangements very thoughtfully." He explained again what I had begun to understand the day before. The trust protected the property exactly as Robert had intended. No one else had authority to pressure a sale or rearrange the terms without my decision. He also reminded me that the long-term beneficiary Robert named was Lily, something Robert had chosen quietly several years ago. I thanked him for clarifying the details and asked a few additional questions about maintaining the trust exactly as Robert designed it. When I finally stepped back outside into the late morning sunlight, the downtown square felt calm and familiar. A small breeze moved through the trees that lined the sidewalks, and the bell above the cafe door chimed as someone stepped inside for lunch. I stood there for a moment, watching the steady rhythm of people moving through their ordinary day. Daniel believed the situation could be solved with distance and persuasion. But Robert had built something much steadier than either of those things. And as I walked back to my car, I realized that sometimes the quietest preparation carries the strongest protection. When I returned home from the law office that afternoon, the quiet of the house felt different than it had a few days earlier. It was no longer the heavy silence of uncertainty. It was the calm stillness that comes when a person finally understands where things stand. I placed my purse on the small table near the front door and walked slowly into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water while the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains. Outside, a pair of neighbors were trimming hedges along the sidewalk, their voices drifting faintly across the yard. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had, and I found comfort in that steady rhythm. I had just begun preparing a simple dinner when my phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. The name on the screen read Emily. For a moment, I simply looked at it. Since the dinner conversation several days earlier, she had not called once. I answered calmly. "Hello, Emily." Her voice sounded careful, almost rehearsed. "Hi, Mom. I was wondering if you might have time to talk." I moved to the kitchen table and sat down. "Of course." There was a brief pause before she continued. "Daniel and I have been thinking about your situation. We just want to make sure you are comfortable living alone in that house." The wording was polite, but I could hear Daniel's influence in every sentence. Practical, concerned, carefully framed. "I appreciate your concern," I replied quietly. "I am quite comfortable." Emily hesitated again. I could almost imagine her glancing toward Daniel while she spoke. "Well, the house is pretty large for one person. Daniel thinks it might make sense to consider selling it and moving somewhere smaller. Maybe a condo, something easier to manage." I traced a small circle on the table with my fingertip while listening to her words. The suggestion sounded almost identical to what Lily had repeated earlier. Nothing about the tone was aggressive. In fact, it was presented as thoughtful advice. But the intention behind it was becoming clearer with each conversation. "That is an interesting idea," I said calmly. "But it is not something I plan to do." Another pause followed, longer this time. When Emily spoke again, her voice carried a hint of frustration she was trying to hide. "Mom, we are just trying to help. It might make things easier for everyone." Easier. The same word again. I looked toward the hallway where Robert's office door remained slightly open. The memory of the documents I had reviewed earlier that day gave me a quiet sense of clarity. "I understand what you believe would be easier," I answered gently. "But your father and I made certain plans for the house a long time ago." Emily sounded confused. "What do you mean?" I chose my words carefully. Your father created a trust to protect the property and the rest of our assets. Those arrangements are still in place." The line went silent for several seconds. Then Emily spoke again, her voice noticeably more cautious. "I did not realize that." I could imagine Daniel standing nearby, listening closely. "It is not something your father felt the need to discuss often," I said calmly. "But he believed in planning ahead." Emily cleared her throat softly. "Well, we can talk about it another time." "Yes," I replied. "Another time might be best." When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the evening sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the backyard. Daniel had asked me to disappear. Yet now it was clear that he had also been quietly counting on something else. What he had not expected was that Robert had already thought several steps further ahead than anyone else. The following Saturday afternoon arrived with the quiet steadiness of early fall in Cedar Falls. The air carried a light coolness, and the maple leaves along the street had begun turning faint shades of gold and orange. I spent most of the morning tending to small things around the house, trimming the plants near the porch and wiping the dust from the living room shelves. The routine felt grounding. After lunch, I heard the familiar sound of a car slowing near the curb outside. When I glanced through the front window, I saw Emily's car parked along the street. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang. I walked to the front door and opened it calmly. Emily stood there holding her purse with both hands, her expression careful and uncertain. Daniel stood a few steps behind her on the walkway, his posture straight and confident in the same way it had always been. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then I stepped aside and invited them in. The living room looked warm in the afternoon light, the same room where Emily had grown up watching movies on rainy evenings while Robert read the newspaper in his chair. Emily sat down on the couch, while Daniel remained standing for a moment before finally taking the armchair across from her. I sat opposite them in Robert's old chair, folding my hands loosely in my lap. Emily cleared her throat softly. "Mom, we thought it might be good to talk in person." I nodded slightly. "That seems reasonable." Daniel leaned forward a little, resting his elbows on his knees in a posture that suggested polite concern. "Margaret," he began, "we have been thinking a lot about what we discussed the other night." His tone was measured and calm, the same tone he had used at the dinner table days earlier. "We just want to make sure everyone's future is handled in the most practical way." I listened without interrupting. Daniel continued carefully. "That house is a large responsibility. Emily and I were thinking that if you decided to sell it, we could help you find something more manageable." Emily nodded quietly beside him. I let a few seconds pass before responding. The room remained very still, and I could hear the faint ticking of the hallway clock again. "I spoke with the attorney who helped your father and me organize our estate plans," I said gently. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, though he tried to hide it. Emily looked at me with mild surprise. "You did?" she asked. I nodded. "Your father arranged a trust several years ago to protect the house and the rest of our assets." Daniel straightened in his chair. "I was not aware of that." His voice remained polite, but there was a new tension behind it. "Most people were not," I replied calmly. "Your father preferred to prepare quietly rather than explain everything in advance." Emily looked from me to Daniel, clearly unsure what to say. I continued speaking in the same steady tone. "The trust states that I will live here as long as I wish. After that, the property will pass directly to Lily." The words settled into the room with quiet certainty. Emily blinked in surprise. Daniel remained silent, though his jaw tightened slightly. I held his gaze without anger. "You once suggested that disappearing would be a gift," I said gently. "But your father believed that stability was a greater gift for the next generation." The hallway clock ticked again. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees along the street. After a long moment, Emily lowered her eyes, absorbing what she had just heard. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair, realizing that the future he had imagined was not the one Robert had arranged. I stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen. "Would either of you like some coffee?" I asked calmly, as though the conversation had been nothing more than a quiet family discussion on an ordinary afternoon.